Welcome to Part 4 of Murder and Marriage. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 10. The Solitary Initial. Gretchen, the chambermaid, leaned over the banister, straining to see what was happening in the spacious reception hall below. Her limited grasp of English made it hard for her to catch much of the conversation. As the voices faded into the distance, she straightened up and rubbed her sore muscles. After casting a quick glance down the corridor toward Mrs. Norby's room, she turned to her right and collided with Suzanne. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, flustered, her cheeks flushing. Suzanne bent down to pick up the lingerie that had fallen from her hands and smiled gently. "My dear, you're in quite a rush," she observed. "But why do you look so pale?" She noticed Gretchen's color draining. Gretchen gasped. "It's this house. It makes me anxious." Tears brimmed in her eyes, and she swiftly brushed them away. She stepped closer to Suzanne, who regarded her with genuine concern. "Did you go with Madame to the funeral?" "Yes," Suzanne replied, her kind expression shifting to one of seriousness. The service was simple at the chapel, but the grave was crowded with strangers. They came too close until someone in charge had to push them back. Mademoiselle Brandi was very upset, and Madame Norby was quite furious. "Have they returned?" Gretchen asked timidly. "Yes, here comes Madame now," Suzanne said, as they heard Mrs. Norby's voice approaching on the staircase. With a startled glance behind her, Gretchen hurried past Suzanne and dashed down the corridor toward the back stairs. Suzanne watched her leave thoughtfully for a moment before stepping forward to meet Mrs. Norby at the top of the circular staircase. "Shall I pack Madame's trunks?" she inquired as the older woman paused to catch her breath from the brisk climb upstairs. "No, Mr. Jackson wants us to stay here for several more days," Mrs. Norby replied. "Norby, have you seen Miss Brandi?" "Yes, Madame. She has gone to her room." Suzanne followed her employer down the hallway. "Dr. de la Cruz just called to say he'll be here soon to see Mademoiselle Brandi." "Very well, please notify me immediately," she said with emphasis. "When he arrives, wait for me in my bedroom, Suzanne." With that, Mrs. Norby crossed the boudoir. Without knocking, she opened the door to her daughter's room and stepped inside. Brandi looked up from the couch where she had flung herself some 20 minutes earlier, and upon seeing her mother, half rose. "Don't get up." Mrs. Norby pulled a chair closer to the couch and sat down. Brandi's heart sank at her mother's serious demeanor. "There's something we need to talk about." Instinctively, Brandi steadied herself. Her mother's something was bound to be unpleasant. It usually was. "I noticed, Brandi, that during the funeral services you sat in the same pew as Dr. Curtis." "Yes, Mother, I did." Brandi sensed that her mother expected a response as she paused for effect. "And you took his arm and walked with him afterward from the chapel to the grave." "I did." She looked directly at her mother. "He is blind, you know." "So that's what it was, charity." Mrs. Norby nodded, clearly pleased. "But, dear, don't let your compassionate heart overrule our common sense. It is no longer necessary for you to maintain an acquaintance with Dr. Curtis." "I'm sorry, Mother." Brandi felt her pulse quickening. "I disagree with you." Mrs. Norby leaned back in her chair. "When you speak to me like that, Brandi, I know you're going to be stubborn, but you must listen. The so-called engagement between you and Dr. Curtis is over." "On what grounds?" She met her mother's gaze head-on. "Pragmatism." "Brandi, how dare you?" Brandi straightened her slender frame and tilted her head back defiantly. "On the contrary, Mother," she said firmly, "Dr. Curtis and I will fulfill Uncle John's plans to the letter." Norby stared at her, stunned. "You mean?" "That our wedding will happen before the week is over." Mrs. Norby, furious, sat in silence for a moment. When she finally spoke, her tone was more conciliatory. "Heroics have their place," she began, "but before this impulsive marriage takes place, there are many factors to consider. First, Dr. Curtis is blind. He has no future." She paused. but he does have a past. Please explain what you mean, Mother, Brandi urged, as Mrs. Norby hesitated again. Has he told you anything about his past life? No, Brandi's pale cheeks flushed crimson. We've never had a long conversation. Perhaps that's for the best, she said dryly. I've begun an investigation. Brandi sprang to her feet, her usual calm demeanor replaced by passionate intensity. I warn you, Mother, to end any so-called investigations. Is your record, and mine, so faultless in this hurried, reckless marriage that we can afford to tarnish the man who, under the crushing burden of blindness and poverty, agreed to it? Brandi. Stop, Mother. Let me speak, she said, as Mrs. Norby raised her hand to silence her. Dr. Curtis provided us the means to fulfill that mysterious obligation Uncle John insisted on by agreeing to marry me, and through that marriage, in name only, I will inherit a vast fortune. Your uncle's death changes that. Does it? For the first time, Brandi avoided her mother's gaze. Dr. Curtis has shown himself to be a gentleman and a man of integrity in his treatment of me. Just yesterday, when Coroner Penfield was harassing me, he came to my aid. I, she lifted her head proudly, will not be complicit in any act, whether open or hidden, that tries to dig into his past. With that, the door slammed behind Brandi as she rushed out. She pressed her hands against her flushed cheeks and leaned breathlessly against the wall of the boudoir, trying to regain her composure before heading to Stephanie's room. Downstairs in the library, Sam Jackson wiped his bald head with a large silk handkerchief and gratefully accepted Starnes' suggestion of a cocktail from what had once been John Norby's private stock. Let's make it 3, he added. I'm sure Mr. McDermott will join me, and Dr. Curtis will be here shortly. As the butler left, Jackson turned to Franklin McDermott. A cocktail, he said dryly, might make you a more agreeable companion. McDermott shifted his attention from his neatly pressed trousers to Jackson's flushed face. Why so worked up? He asked. Sit down and take it easy. The look that Jackson directed at his younger companion was anything but friendly. Take it easy, he scoffed. Where is that fool, Hull? Are you referring to Colonel Julian Hull? McDermott didn't bother to hide his amusement. I believe my esteemed senior partner is currently in our office watching the stock market, he said, glancing at his watch. And you should be with him, Jackson retorted just as forcefully. What on earth are you doing hanging around this house? Isn't that my concern? McDermott's pale cheeks turned a deep shade of red, yet he showed no real anger. His voice retained its teasing tone, a quality that many found quite irritating. It might be the coroner's concern if you're not careful, Jackson exploded, losing the small amount of patience he had left after a trying morning. What on earth made you think it was okay not to show up at the inquest yesterday afternoon? My dear Jackson, McDermott replied with a tolerant smile. I explained in my note to Coroner Penfield, which I understand he graciously read at the inquest, that since I wasn't in the house at the time John Norby died, my testimony wouldn't add anything to the investigation. His voice carried to the far end of the library, and David Curtis listened intently as he maneuvered his way toward the two men, skillfully avoiding the furniture. So absorbed were they in their own conversation that neither noticed his approach. Curtis paused just behind Jackson and lightly tapped his cane against the side of a mahogany card table. McDermott shot a quick glance behind him before settling back into a relaxed posture, while Jackson stepped aside and rested his hand on the back of a chair. Hello, Curtis, Jackson said, sliding the chair he held toward the blind surgeon. Have a seat and make yourself comfortable. Here comes Starnes with the cocktails. Thanks, but I'll pass, Curtis replied as the butler stopped in front of him, a silver tray in hand. Cocktails and serious thinking don't mix well. And what does your serious thinking involve? McDermott asked with a chuckle, taking one of the frosted glasses. He finished his drink before Starnes could serve the lawyer. If you're not going to have the one Dr. Curtis dismissed, I'll gladly take it, Jackson. He sipped the second cocktail more slowly and then turned to Curtis. You still haven't answered my question, Doctor. Ever heard of the fourth dimension, McDermott? Curtis smiled as he addressed the young stockbroker, his grin widening at the latter's sulky nod. Well, a puzzle like that offers excellent mental relaxation. For a blind man, McDermott interrupted, with a hint of scorn. Exactly, Curtis replied, unperturbed. He then turned to their quiet companion. What's got you so restless, Jackson? You've clicked your watch cover shut half a dozen times since I've been sitting here. Jackson tucked his hunting case, watch back into his pocket. Mrs. Norby is late, he said. We need to be at the Metropolis Bank in 20 minutes. McDermott leaned forward, a hint of eagerness in his demeanor. So you're going to open John Norby's safe deposit box today, he remarked. I heard the bank officials had postponed it until later in the week. I can't imagine who your source could be, the lawyer replied dryly, but it hasn't been postponed, only rescheduled to accommodate Coroner Penfield. Ah, here comes Mrs. Norby, he added as the widow appeared in the doorway. Don't let me interrupt you, Franklin, she called out as McDermott joined Jackson at the door. Oh, Dr. Curtis, I didn't see you at first, she said, finally noticing the blind surgeon over Jackson's shoulder. She turned to the lawyer. I apologize for making you wait, Sam, but Brandi kept me longer than I expected. How long do you think we'll be at the bank? About an hour, maybe 2, but definitely no longer, Jackson added, noticing her look of concern. In case we're delayed returning, Mrs. Norby said, addressing Curtis directly, I've instructed Starnes to serve lunch without waiting for us. Doctor, I trust you'll play the host in our absence. Thank you, Mrs. Norby, Curtis replied with a respectful nod. He couldn't see the sudden scowl that Franklin McDermott shot his way, but he sensed that Mrs. Norby's polite demeanor masked a simmering hostility that he recognized had been lurking since their first encounter, ready to surface at any moment. Stephanie Hull had carelessly informed him that Mrs. Norby had not taken well to his presence at the house party, and Curtis believed that only a dire necessity had compelled her to agree to her brother-in-law's plan for him to marry her daughter. Starnes' arrival broke up the small gathering. Damison is at the door with the car, madam, he announced, and with a curtsy to Curtis, Mrs. Norby moved away, Jackson following her. McDermott was about to follow when Starnes called out to him. Inspector Cowser just called to see if you were here, sir, he said. He's waiting to speak with you. McDermott swore under his breath. Tell him to go to Guinea, he snapped. No, wait, he added as Starnes bowed and stepped back. I'll take the call. And he hurried back into the library to the small table in the corner where the branch telephone, reserved exclusively for John Norby's use, stood. From the snippets of McDermott's one-sided conversation with Inspector Cowser, Curtis gathered that it was not a pleasant exchange, judging by the few terse replies from the stockbroker. When he hung up the receiver a few minutes later, he wore a scowl. Those detectives are relentless, he muttered, striding over to the smoking stand to light an expensive cigar. Cowser insists I wait until he arrives. Is that going to be an inconvenience for you? Curtis inquired politely. McDermott shrugged, but any response he might have given faded when he caught sight of Stephanie and Brandi walking across the lawn toward the lodge. Without saying a word to Curtis, he opened the French window and hurried after the two girls. Curtis moved to the window, standing there to watch the lawn. He didn't realize that his tall frame, dressed in a well-tailored grey suit, was silhouetted against the dark background of the library, nor did he notice that, at McDermott's call, Brandi and her cousin turned around. Brandi's gaze drifted past McDermott to find Curtis. She instinctively raised her hand in a friendly wave, then let it drop. For a brief moment, she forgot he was blind. A lump formed in her throat as she spoke to McDermott, her expression turning somber as she walked alongside him and Stephanie to the lodge. It was nearly 10 minutes before Curtis left the window and made his way slowly upstairs to his bedroom. He paused beside his bed, laying his cane across it. As he did so, his hand brushed against some clothing. He picked it up and discovered it was a suit of pajamas. Curtis bent down and quickly ran his hand over the bed. It was as he suspected, neatly made. So why were his pajamas laid out on the bed at noon? Had Gretchen, the chambermaid, forgotten to put them away, or was it just carelessness from Tiasca, his Filipino valet? Feeling puzzled, Curtis picked up his pajamas again. As he felt over the jacket, he pulled out a handkerchief from the pocket. Bringing it close to his nose, he caught the faint scent of chloroform. A faint, barely there trace of chloroform lingered, just enough for Curtis to recognize the handkerchief as the one tossed to him by the mysterious woman in John Norby's bedroom on the night of Norby's murder. He sank into the nearest chair and laid the pajamas across his lap. In the whirlwind of recent events, he had completely forgotten about the handkerchief he had absent-mindedly stuffed into his pajamas when he returned to his room to rest after finding Norby's body. The handkerchief seemed to be made of the finest linen and was delicately small. With nimble fingers, he felt around its edges. Was there any mark that might reveal the identity of the enigmatic woman from Norby's bedroom? His long, sensitive fingers paused at one corner, and slowly he traced the solitary initial, the capital letter A. Chapter 11. The hand on the counterpane. A light knock at his bedroom door roused Curtis from his thoughts. He sprang from his bed, hurried to his bureau, and retrieved his dispatch box. With care, he locked the handkerchief inside, and only then did he turn back to the door. "Come in," he called out, his voice firm as the knock grew more urgent. Dr. Leonard de la Cruz entered quickly, shutting the door behind him. "I'm glad I found you, Dave," he said, noting Curtis' pleased grin as he recognized his voice. "I came to see Brandi Norby, but she's gone out driving with Stephanie Hull and Franklin McDermott. Starnes told me you were here, so I came upstairs." Curtis let out a sigh of relief. "I'm really happy you're here, Leonard," he said earnestly. "To be honest, I was just thinking about calling you to come over right away." "Really?" De la Cruz settled into a comfortable chair near the recovering surgeon. "What's on your mind, and why are you holding a pair of pajamas?" Curtis picked up the pajamas, which he had tossed aside when he heard the knock. "I'll fill you in soon enough," he replied, taking a seat. "But please keep this conversation confidential, Leonard." De la Cruz nodded slowly, considering. "I assume this is about John Norby's murder," and he paused. "Brandi." "Why do you think they're connected?" Curtis asked quickly. "It's what everyone is discussing," De la Cruz said, noticing the tension etched on Curtis' face, which made his expression grow more serious. "Coroner Penfield informed me about the inquest and that you insisted Brandi should have legal representation." "How?" he said, shooting a sharp look at his companion. "Did you end up selecting Sam Jackson?" "Brandi requested him," replied Curtis. "Isn't he a decent lawyer?" Yes, that's what I hear." De la Cruz's tone lacked conviction, "but he isn't a criminal lawyer." Curtis moved his chair closer to De la Cruz. "Do you think it might lead to that?" he asked, his anxiety plain on his face. De la Cruz nodded gravely. "It seems to me that Brandi knows more than she's letting on," he said. "Why she's holding back information that could help the police find her uncle's murderer is one of the real puzzles in this case." "But there's nothing criminal about that," protested Curtis. "Unless it amounts to being an accessory after the fact," De la Cruz pointed out. He paused before asking, "What facts are known that link Brandi to the murder?" Curtis leaned back in his chair and counted the points on his fingers. First, Starnes, the butler, said he overheard John Norby arguing with a female in his bedroom that night. He thought it was Brandi because he thought he recognized her dress. Secondly, Gretchen, the chambermaid, reported hearing a conversation between a man and a woman under her window after midnight. The woman said, "I will do it tonight," and the man replied, "Don't lose your nerve." "Well, did Gretchen identify the woman?" De la Cruz inquired, noting Curtis's pause. "Indirectly, yes. She refused, as she put it, to tell on her young me's." Curtis hesitated. "Her statement was good enough for the coroner, and she was let go." "I see." De la Cruz stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Well, what's next?" I overheard Mrs. Norby talking to Brandi in the hall right after I found Norby's body. Curtis spoke with increasing reluctance, and de la Cruz nodded in silent understanding. Mrs. Norby didn't say anything to tie Brandi to the crime, but it did confirm that Brandi was up and around at the time of her uncle's murder. Quite so, it did, de la Cruz agreed. He lowered his voice. Did anything come up at the inquest about the parrot and its cry? Brandi, I've caught you, you devil. No. De la Cruz leaned back and frowned. I wonder why not, he muttered. The inquest isn't finished, Curtis reminded him. It's only adjourned until Thursday. And today is Tuesday morning, which gives us very little time to unravel the mystery of Norby's death. Curtis sighed, leaning in to place his hand on de la Cruz's knee. Can I count on your help, Leonard? Absolutely. Great. Curtis's face lit up with his engaging smile. We must work to clear Brandi. She shouldn't be pulled any further into the spotlight. If only it stopped there. The exclamation slipped out of de la Cruz without meaning to. I'm afraid, Dave, that Coroner Penfield is holding back more than just the parrot incident to reveal at the next inquest hearing. That's possible, Curtis acknowledged. Penfield cut his direct examination short after revealing the hair he and Inspector Cowser found tangled around the button on Norby's pajamas. The hair matched Brandi's in color and texture. And Penfield claimed it got caught there when Brandi pressed her ear against Norby's heart, trying to check if it was still beating, de la Cruz interjected. That was a clever deduction on his part. Indeed, and based on the facts as he understood them, Curtis replied. Is the hall door closed, Leonard? Are we alone? De la Cruz glanced at the door and then around the room. The door is shut, he said. Rising, he walked over to it, opened it briefly to scan the empty hall, then closed the door and turned the key in the lock. We're completely alone, Dave. Go ahead and say what you need to. Curtis waited until de la Cruz had taken his seat again. After I informed Sam Jackson of Norby's death, I went back with him to the body, he began. Jackson left me to call Coroner Penfield. As I waited for him to come back, I noticed some hair caught around Norby's jacket button, clearly from a woman's head. I paused for a moment. When I first discovered Norby, he was lying partly on his right side, his face pressed against the carpet and his arms spread out. I read that in your written statement, de la Cruz interrupted. But when I examined the body again, it was lying on its back, Curtis continued. Really? De la Cruz shot a questioning look at his blind companion. Why didn't you mention that at the inquest? I wasn't asked about it, Curtis replied evenly. If I'm called back for the next hearing, I will bring it up. In the meantime. Yes, de la Cruz urged as Curtis hesitated. I need your advice, and if necessary, your help. Of course, go on. De la Cruz listened intently, though his impatience grew as Curtis slowly chose his words. I unraveled several strands of hair, Curtis said, and placed them in my wallet. Later that same morning, yesterday, I showed them to Teoscar and asked him what color they were. He said the hairs were white. White, de la Cruz exclaimed, clearly surprised. Teoscar insisted they were white, Curtis reiterated. I had to rely on his sight. But de la Cruz wiped the sweat from his forehead with his handkerchief. The hair Penfield found around the button was chestnut. I've seen it, and it definitely came from Brandi. Maybe Teoscar lied to me about the hair being white. Certainly he could have, perhaps to protect Brandi. The servants are loyal to her, de la Cruz remarked. If you show me the hair, I can clarify this matter. Sadly, the hair has vanished from my wallet. Good heavens! De la Cruz leaned back, his eyes wide with surprise as he took in Curtis. I realized it was gone during the inquest when it was mentioned that the hair Penfield found was chestnut, Curtis continued. Without any evidence to support my claim, I remained silent. I understand. De la Cruz bit his upper lip, lost in thought for a moment before speaking again. There isn't a woman with white hair in the household. Then Teoscar lied, Curtis said, his lips pressed into a firm line. And not for the first time. Pay close attention, Leonard. Though this warning was likely unnecessary, Curtis couldn't see the rapt attention in his friend's eyes as he leaned back in his chair. While preparing for dinner last Sunday, I instructed Teoscar to tie a string on the outside knob of my door so that when I returned upstairs alone, I could easily identify my room. Did he do it? No, Teoscar insists I never asked him to do that. Curtis spoke with deliberate slowness. After finding Norby dead in the hall, I searched for my room, and spotting a string hanging from the knob of a closed door, I entered, thinking it was mine. Whose room was it? John Norby's. De la Cruz leaned back again, rubbing his forehead with his handkerchief. I can't make sense of this, he exclaimed. Unfortunately, I struggle to see it at all, Curtis said, suppressing a sigh with a soft cough. Here's the crux of the matter, Leonard. A string was tied to John Norby's door, and it's still there. A string was also attached to my door on Sunday evening, but it had been cut off before I went upstairs. What? Instead of answering, Curtis stood up and walked over to his bureau. He retrieved his dispatch box from the drawer and walked over to the bed. With a turn of the key, he opened the lid. Take a look at this piece of string, he said, holding it up. One end is tied in a loop, but it's been cut. He handed the string to Leonard. I found it lying in front of my door, partially hidden under the hall carpet. De la Cruz studied the string intently. Just a second, he said suddenly. I'll be right back. He hurried out through the hall door, locking it behind him. While he was gone, Curtis stood by the bed, listening intently. It was only a few minutes before de la Cruz returned. I compared this string with the one still hanging from Norby's door, he explained, placing it in Curtis' hand. It's the same color and weight, and it looks like it was cut from the same spool of twine. And Teoscar insists that I never asked him to tie a string to my door, Curtis pondered, putting the string back in the dispatch box. Could he have tied the string to your door, then cut it off, and tied one on Norby's door as a prank? De la Cruz asked. And after everything that happened on Sunday night, was he too scared to admit it? That's a reasonable theory, Curtis conceded, though he still sounded unsure. But why would he choose John Norby's door? Come on, throw me an easy question, de la Cruz replied. Did you go into Norby's bedroom, Dave? Yes, I called Sam Jackson from there. Curtis paused, then added with a serious tone. While I was standing by the phone trying to remember Jackson's number, I heard a woman moving around in the bedroom. De la Cruz's eyes widened in surprise. Go on, he urged, eager for more. Did she see you? No. I didn't turn on the electric lights, Curtis said, keeping his voice low but clear. As she passed me on her way out of the room, she tossed this handkerchief my way. He pulled it from his dispatch box and handed it to de la Cruz. When I picked it up, I could smell chloroform distinctly. De la Cruz examined the handkerchief closely, turning it over several times, until he spotted a single initial. He said, the weight of his tone unmistakable. Brandi, he set the handkerchief back into the dispatch box. Lock it up, Dave, he instructed. Have you shown this to Coroner Penfield? No, Curtis slipped the key to the dispatch box into his pocket. I know you won't like this, Leonard, but his tone turned serious. I refuse to involve Brandi Norby any further in her uncle's murder. I agree with you, de la Cruz replied. Still, I wish you had spoken to me about the handkerchief sooner. This is the first time I've seen you since we were in Norby's bedroom yesterday, Curtis pointed out. But I must admit, I forgot about the handkerchief. I had it in the pocket of my pajamas, and only remembered it when I found the pajamas lying on this bed about 15 minutes before you arrived. You really have some lazy habits, de la Cruz remarked, his tone lighter, leaving your pajamas scattered around your room at this hour. I didn't leave them there, Curtis protested. I don't know who could have placed them on the bed. It's made up, isn't it? De la Cruz looked at the bed as Curtis crossed the room to his bureau, dispatch box in hand. The bed is indeed made, de la Cruz said slowly. He noticed something and stepped closer, leaning in to inspect. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "There's a handprint on the counterpane." "Monsieur le Docteur," de la Cruz straightened quickly to meet Suzanne's frightened gaze. The French maid stood by the hall door, slightly open. "Mademoiselle Brandi is calling for you. Hurry." Chapter 12. Murder. David Curtis was not far behind Leonard de la Cruz as they approached the hall, instinctively following in the direction Leonard had taken. Brandi Norby paused at the top of the circular staircase, turning back to meet them. "Oh, Dr. de la Cruz," she called out. "I found poor Gretchen collapsed right here. She's starting to come around now. Thank you," she said to Inspector Cowser, who was sitting on the top step, supporting the chambermaid's head on his broad shoulder. "You were so kind." "Not at all, Miss Norby." Cowser, visibly uncomfortable in his caregiving role, was relieved to pass on the responsibility to de la Cruz and Suzanne, who, at Brandi's gesture, helped steady the half-conscious Dutch girl. Starnes, having heard the ruckus from the square hall at the foot of the staircase, had wisely fetched a glass of water and a smaller glass of whiskey. He arrived just as de la Cruz and Suzanne managed to lay Gretchen down on a broad settee nestled in a window alcove off the corridor. Suzanne carefully placed a pillow beneath Gretchen's head and loosened her black gown with a skillfulness that earned a nod of approval from de la Cruz. After some coaxing, they finally got Gretchen to take a swallow of the whiskey, and she grimaced as the strong liquid slid down her throat. It quickly chased away the heavy faintness that had overtaken her. At last convinced that Gretchen would be all right on her own, with Suzanne at her side, de la Cruz left her and approached the small group gathered at the top of the staircase. "What triggered Gretchen's breakdown?" de la Cruz asked, lowering his voice to avoid being overheard by either Suzanne or the Dutch girl. "I'm not sure, Doctor," Brandi replied. "She's been on edge, acting strangely ever since the inquest." Inspector Cowser, who had been closely observing David Curtis as he stood beside Brandi, joined the conversation. "I might have startled your maid without meaning to," he said apologetically. "Starnes informed me that Dr. de la Cruz was with Dr. Curtis, so I came upstairs without announcing myself. I typically don't make a fuss," he added with a small smile. "Your maid was unaware of my presence, and when she caught sight of me, she fainted." "Excuse me, mademoiselle." Suzanne had stepped away from Gretchen and moved closer just in time to hear Cowser's comment. "All night and today, poor Gretchen has been followed by what you call shadows." "Shadows?" Brandi asked, frowning at the unfamiliar term. "Spies, if monsieur will allow me to use that word," Suzanne said, casting a disdainful glance at Inspector Cowser. "The poor girl is overwhelmed with fear." "What does she have to be afraid of?" Cowser demanded sharply, but Suzanne turned slightly away from him, refusing to answer. "Please, mademoiselle," she began again, addressing Brandi. "Gretchen needs peace, or she will fall ill. She is a good girl." "She is," Brandi exclaimed with sudden determination. "Come, Inspector, there's no law that permits you to bring spies into our home." "I apologize," Cowser replied stiffly. "We have not overstepped our rights. Investigations must be carried out when a crime has taken place." "A crime?" "Yes, madam, and the most serious of all, murder, cold-blooded, premeditated murder." Curtis stood close beside Brandi and noticed her sharp intake of breath, yet she faced Cowser without revealing any other sign of emotion. "Do you still insist that my uncle was murdered?" she asked, "and that it wasn't a case of suicide during a moment of mental distress?" "I do. The medical evidence confirms that." Cowser wanted to elaborate, but Brandi turned quickly to Curtis. "Can you definitively determine from the wound that it wasn't self-inflicted, Dr. Curtis?" she pressed. All eyes were on the blind surgeon. De la Cruz, just like Curtis, noticed the unspoken plea in Brandi's voice and eagerly awaited Curtis's response, which took the form of a question. "Was John Norby by any chance ambidextrous?" he inquired. "He was." A startled sound escaped Cowser. "Why didn't you mention that at the inquest?" he asked, a touch of annoyance in his tone. "Because I was never asked about it," she replied, then turned back to Curtis. "Doesn't that suggest that Uncle John could have taken his own life?" Curtis's pause was nearly imperceptible, but de la Cruz caught it. "I believe that the fact that Norby was ambidextrous will allow experts to cast enough doubt on the medical testimony to render it nearly worthless," he said. "Perhaps an expert could dismantle it," Cowser interjected, "but you cannot overlook the fact that no weapon was found near the body. If John Norby did kill himself, where did he hide the weapon?" "I can tell you." A fresh spark ignited in Brandi's eyes, and her voice carried an unfamiliar tone, one of hope intertwined with relief. "I read your testimony in the morning paper, Dr. Curtis, as presented at the inquest. You mentioned that Uncle John lay partly on his right side, with his arms stretched out and his head resting against the banisters that line this part of the corridor." As she spoke, she stepped away from the top of the stairs and moved to the spot where Norby's body had been, the others following closely behind her. "Now, let's say," she began, looking directly at Inspector Cowser, who was watching her intently, "let's say Uncle John had the weapon, just a knife, for example." Her voice quivered for a moment, but then she steadied herself and continued more calmly. "If he carried the knife down this corridor, what could have happened to it?" "I've no idea," Cowser muttered. "We've searched every nook and cranny. There are no hidden spaces in this corridor that we have missed, and we've found no sign of a weapon at all. Tell me, Miss Norby, did someone take it away before we arrived?" "No." Cowser flushed with anger as he turned to face her. He was quick to sense mockery, and he felt increasingly that Brandi was making fun of him. "Stop joking around," he snapped, "and answer your own question if you can. If Norby had a weapon in his hand, where did it go?" "The most logical thing could have happened," she replied, and this time a note of triumph rang clear in her voice. "As Uncle John fell forward, the knife could have slipped from his hand and dropped through the banisters to the hall below. Look," she leaned over the railing. The men around her instinctively followed her lead, even Curtis, caught up in the excitement, momentarily forgetting his blindness as he leaned over as well. The grand circular staircase, with its solid mahogany railing, was designed in a colonial style. It began from the square hall beneath, and with its unusually wide treads, required a larger well than normal. The banisters didn't end at the top of the stairs, but curved around the well, providing protection for the bedroom floor and a clear view of the entrance hall and the front door. At the base of the staircase in the entrance hall, rows of potted hothouse plants stretched nearly to the library door. John Norby had always appreciated the vibrant green leaves against the white wainscoting, so the previous winter he replaced the cushioned benches that once filled the space with these planters. "That's an interesting theory of yours, Miss Norby," Cowser acknowledged. "If the knife fell between one of these banister posts, it must have landed in that flower box. Let's check it out." He turned and hurried down the staircase, with de la Cruz trailing close behind him. Brandi took a step forward, but then paused. In the next moment, a small hand slipped into Curtis as he turned to follow the others. "Come this way," she whispered. A rosy hue spread across her pale cheeks as she noticed his face brighten. But concern quickly replaced his smile as he tightened his grip on her cold fingers. "Are you feeling cold?" he asked, stopping short. "Oh no, it's just nerves." Her smile was somewhat pitiful. "I'll be fine. Please don't worry. I wonder, She paused her scattered thoughts as they continued down the staircase and joined de la Cruz. Despite the risk of damaging the expensive ferns and other plants in the boxes, Cowser and de la Cruz eagerly sifted through the greenery, their hands moving with frantic energy among the leaves and the mossy cover. They worked quickly through the boxes until a sharp, excited cry from Inspector Cowser, who had outpaced both de la Cruz and Curtis, drew the others to his side. Pulling his hand from a box brimming with ferns, he held up a small, tarnished knife. "Found it," he exclaimed. "Don't touch it, Doctor." He carefully placed the knife, gripping it delicately between two fingers into a clean handkerchief, and extended it toward de la Cruz for a closer look. Those are bloodstains. Probably, de la Cruz said, leaning in closer. We'll need a chemical test, Causer, to differentiate between blood, rust, and fingerprints. Of course. Just hold it for a moment, Doctor, wrapped in the handkerchief, but keep it safe. Causer thrust the handkerchief into de la Cruz's eager grasp and rushed back to the pantry, returning a moment later with Detective Sergeant Brown following him as they hurried up the staircase. Describe the knife, Leonard, Curtis instructed as de la Cruz stepped closer to him. De la Cruz paused for a moment, and Brandi, who had been watching the two men intently, was about to speak when de la Cruz broke the silence. It's a curious weapon, he said slowly, but quite effective, Dave. It's a scalpel. A scalpel, Curtis echoed. Yes, one made by Manic. De la Cruz lowered his hand. Where do you think John Norby got a surgical knife? Curtis's face lit up with intrigue. A surgical knife, he murmured. Strange, he hesitated, then spoke more rapidly. But the fingerprints will reveal. Murder, Causer's gravelly voice interrupted from behind them, and they turned around. Miss Norby, he said, his gaze fixed on the young girl's face. You've led us to the weapon, which proves beyond doubt that your uncle didn't take his own life. This is a clear case of cold-blooded murder. Please explain what you mean, Curtis urged before his shocked companions could respond. Causer stepped back a few paces. Look up there, he pointed as he spoke, gesturing to the next floor where Detective Sergeant Brown was leaning over the railing, gazing down at them. The sergeant is standing exactly where John Norby's body was found by Dr. Curtis. Now, he said with great seriousness, if John Norby had that surgical knife, as you wisely suggested, Miss Norby, and it slipped from his hand, it would have landed in that box of ferns. He gestured towards a nearby plant. There's no way it could have fallen from there into the box where I discovered it. Brandi stared at the inspector in confusion. I don't understand, she stammered. You found the knife. In the wrong place to support your theory of suicide. Causer's subtle smile sent a chill down Brandi's spine. Just a moment. Curtis switched his cane to the other hand and stepped closer to the inspector. Causer, what if you have the sergeant drop a penknife or some ordinary knife through the banisters? Causer studied him intently. You mean? To recreate what happened Sunday night, or rather Monday morning, Curtis explained. Have the sergeant stagger and fall. As he does, we can see if the knife slips from his hand and through the banisters, allowing us to know, his voice grew deeper, exactly where it lands. A brilliant idea, de la Cruz exclaimed. Go ahead, Causer. I'll stay here and you can observe from above. But wait, he said as Causer turned toward the staircase. To make the test as thorough as possible, I'll give you a scalpel from my surgical bag. It's right here with my hat. First, though, take this. He handed back the handkerchief and the stained scalpel that Causer had found hidden among the ferns. After retrieving another scalpel from his kit, Franklin McDermott rushed down the stairs and joined Brandi, followed more leisurely by Stephanie Hull. She shuddered slightly as Causer displayed the discolored scalpel before carefully wrapping it in his handkerchief and tucking it into his pocket. To Brandi, it felt like an eternity as she waited for Causer to ascend the staircase and brief Detective Sergeant Brown on the role he was to play. What's happening? McDermott asked. He didn't bother to soften his naturally loud voice, which grated on Brandi's nerves. De la Cruz noticed her sudden tension and, sensing the pressure she was under, quickly explained the situation. Stephanie listened intently, her eyes tracking the movements of the two men on the floor above as far as she could make them out. Watch out down there, Causer called out. Step back a bit more, Dr. Curtis. You're too close. Curtis took a few steps back. Brandi reached out to guide him, but hastily dropped her hand when she caught her cousin's gaze. There was a teasing glint in Stephanie's eyes that sent a rush of color to Brandi's pale cheeks. The warmth hadn't faded when a heavy thud broke the silence. A piece of shining steel shot through the air, falling silently among the ferns and disappearing from view. Leonard de la Cruz spoke first, waiting for Causer and Sergeant Brown to join them. You were right, Causer, he said, addressing the inspector. The scalpel landed directly in this box, he said, placing his hand on it. It's the fourth box from the one where you found the stained scalpel. Then our theory holds, Cowser declared. He nodded solemnly to Brandi. Thank you, Miss Norby. Before she could respond, Starnes emerged from the pantry. Dr. Curtis, you're needed on the telephone, he announced. This way, please, and Curtis silently followed the butler. In an instant, the small gathering in the square reception hall dispersed. Brandi accompanied her cousin to her bedroom, while McDermott, receiving a quiet nod from Inspector Cowser, led the way into the library, followed by the two police officials. Alone now, Leonard de la Cruz neatly packed away his surgical kit, grabbed his hat and overcoat, then paused before opening the front door, lost in thought. 2 full minutes passed before he moved. He placed his hat, overcoat, and bag back on the hall table, turned around, and slowly made his way upstairs to enter David Curtis' bedroom. The bedroom was empty except for him. De la Cruz walked straight to the bed and paused beside it. Leaning down, he examined the crisp linen. It was perfectly smooth, immaculate. He straightened up abruptly, his eyes wide with astonishment. "Can you believe it?" he exclaimed. "They've changed the counterpane."